Thank you, Clarence. Good morning. On behalf of Cabro Bay United Church, I want to extend their greetings to you all, and I'm glad to be here this day. We're here in the midst of the story of Elijah, and the story of Elijah has many different pieces to it. And when Cheryl preached the first week, she talked about it being more metaphor than it being a literal kind of story. And that's an important kind of piece of our context. Often, when we hear these stories, we tend to kind of literalize what's going on. And in that process, we miss some of the underlying meanings. And so we're going to talk a bit more about building on what Cheryl did last time. When I went looking for images of the story of Elijah, there are lots and lots of different ones. And part of the challenge often is that in that literalizing, whenever we find an image, we get lost in trying to uncover it. Because we're mostly used to trying to make sense of the story from our own life experience. Probably the most pronounced way, as when I was looking for images, was this one. So here we have some Renaissance kind of clothing and images of this poor family in poverty. Nothing at all, of course, like what was probably the reality. So instead, I want you just to focus on this image, the idea of the meal, the little bit of flour and the little bit of oil that the widow had left. The story says that Elijah comes and asks the widow to draw some water. There's been a great famine, and people all across the town are starving. This stranger comes in to town, and part of the task when strangers came into town was to offer hospitality. And so the widow is torn. She's torn with her obligation to show hospitality, together with her obligation as a mom to feed her child one last time. So when the stranger says to her, "And bring me a little bit of bread to go with that," she responds in the most courteous way she can, but we hear the undertone. "Sir, I have no bread. I'm going home to make the last bit of meal and oil I have before my son and I will then die." In that sense and in that moment, Elijah offers hope. He offers a promise. You see, at that moment, the widow is having to work with this tension about hospitality. Throughout the Bible, there are lots and lots of stories of the ways in which hospitality becomes the most elevated way in which the community and the individuals are asked to respond. Hospitality was the way in which the community held itself together through good times and bad. Their sense of commitment and responsibility to each other far surpasses our understanding in a North American context of a very individualistic society. Joan Chittister, who works a lot with refugees, says this about hospitality, that hospitality is simply love on the loose. When we decide that hospitality is our main way of being, it changes what our priorities become. So part of what happens in this story is a movement from a sense of scarcity to abundance. And that's a challenging thing to often happen. We easily are convinced by the media and advertisement and everything that happens in our world that somehow we don't have enough, that we should have the newest and the best of. When we go on social media, we're often bombarded by the successes of other people's lives. It can lead us to believe that somehow we're less than, or other people have more than we have. And we get moved into this place sometimes of believing that scarcity is the place from which we come. And out of scarcity comes a sense of fear. But in this story, Elijah helps the woman move from that place of scarcity to an understanding of God's abundance. You see, the cycle of scarcity versus abundance can trap us in lots of ways. In the scarcity cycle, it's all about the individual and our isolated sense. We become and work from a victim perspective. We often move from a place of greed or selfishness, and we are stuck in the sense that there's not enough, and we need to hoard it for ourselves. When we move to a place of abundance, we have a much better sense of us and God and others around us. We see ourselves as part of something larger, that the plight of mine and yours is bound together. Our sense of stewardship is much greater in the midst of that abundant cycle. When we move from scarcity to abundance, we move from a sense of the other as separate from us to someone else as simply someone we don't know yet. So rather than being the stranger and the threat, the person becomes a possible friend or community partner. This is Naya Ozlem. She's from the Netherlands. And she is a counselor and a Muslim who was elected to her legislative assembly. And when she did so, she was a woman of color and a woman of a different faith tradition. And what she found was that she began to have her inbox filled with hate mail. People who took her on for what her appearance was and what her gender was. At one point, one person was hassling her so much, he even found her cell phone number and was phoning her in her own private time when she was at the zoo with her child. One day, caught off guard by one of those phone calls, she simply responded curtly to the man and hung up. And her 8-year-old son said to her, "Mommy, why does this man hate you so much when he doesn't even know you?" Her first kind of flippant response to her son was, "It's simply because he's ignorant and he doesn't know better." But that question from her son haunted her. And so that night, she thought a lot about maybe a different way that she might be. The next day, when that same man called her again, she said to him on the phone, "I don't know you. I've never met you. I'd like to come to your house for coffee." There was a long pause and silence. Then the man said, "I'll need to check with my wife, if that's okay." And she started as a habit to go to people's homes who sent her hate mail. And at this point in her career, she's visited over 100 different people. And she says the key is to go with a hospitable attitude, because people come at her from a place of sense of fear and scarcity. She says you must go to their home. You must bring some food with you, and you must meet them face to face. We are often caught in that same cycle of fear and scarcity and wondering what difference we might make in the world. If you want to hear her whole story, just Google that title and it'll come up on YouTube for you. Henry Nouwen, the renowned person, he was a Catholic priest, says hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. We often think of Elijah as the hero in the story, but in a sense, it's the widow who's the hero in the story. She's the one who offers hospitality, but the change takes place for both of them. For any real kind of interfacing we have with the other means that we're both changed. The same was true for Nazla when she met with those who were her enemies. We pray. We pray the Jesus prayer all the time. Give us this day our daily bread. But in our North American individualistic context, we don't actually hear how radical this is and how connected to the story it is. Give us this day our daily bread. It's not give me this day my daily bread. It's give us. All of the prayer, right from the opening statement of our Father, not my Father, our Father. Everything in that prayer is communal. And so my prayer for our daily bread is a prayer for not only my needs, but for your needs, for our needs to be met. How different it might be if we saw and prayed this prayer in the radical way in which Jesus intended it. We so easily get caught in it's not enough. We often don't know the strangers and the people we meet for whom those persons themselves are hungry or who have a history of that. I don't know, when I look out here, which of you may have grown up not knowing where the next meal was going to come from, or whose mom stretched their food budget so thinly that you were tired of the same peas and mushroom soup on toast. Or perhaps you watched, as I did, my mom not eat because there wasn't enough food. And she simply said, "Oh, I'm just not hungry tonight." Or perhaps you grew up as a child with the Depression, or with parents who grew up in the Depression, and you're still shaped by that experience of it's not quite enough, or we could be without it any moment. Or perhaps you grew up on social assistance, and the amount that was offered was never quite enough, and there wasn't enough for lunches at school. The chew on this campaign that your congregation is engaging in today is a part of addressing that sense of enough. But part of our way through this is to unlearn our fear of scarcity. Because what's happened for us in both North America and in the Western world is we've become hoarders at the expense of many others. Gratitude, when we start from a place of gratitude, turns what we have into enough. And that's what happens in the Elijah story. Elijah invites the widow simply to be thankful for what is, and promises in the same way that the prayer does, that tomorrow will be another day and there will be enough. It's part of what it means to choose whether we see the glass as half full or half empty, whether there's enough or whether there's barely enough. And part of that abundance comes from a shifting to a sense of simplicity. It's out of a sense of simplicity that we get to that place of what is enough. William Ward says 3 keys to more abundant living are caring about others, daring for others, and sharing with others. And so we see that in this Elijah story. However, we get stuck with the lifestyle we've become accustomed to. The problem is, Mahatma Gandhi reminds us of this. The world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. So the Elijah story invites us in to see the world in a different way, to see those who live in poverty and live on the edges not as the other, but as a part of who we are. To invite us to see the stranger and the enemy as someone that we invite in and get to know differently. Abundance is not something that we acquire. It's something we tune into. And so may we, along with Elijah and the widow, embrace what it is that the world has to offer, to see ourselves as living in an abundance and understanding ourselves as responsible to share that abundance from a place of gratitude, love, and grace. Thanks be to God.